Erev Tov, everyone, and welcome. For those who have ever joined on a Friday night, note that one of our customs is after Kabbalat Shabbat, we do a case in Jewish business ethics, where I give a possibly real case, or at least a fictionalized version of something real about somebody who's in a business agreement and they got ripped off or something like that. And the question is, what is the right thing to do? What is the legal thing to do? Either based on general knowledge or within Jewish law, and then everybody gets a chance to give their version of what they think the answer should be. Then I share a quick answer informed by Jewish sources. So both tonight and next week, we're going to look at a couple of simple cases, but the similarity will be I'll present the case, get everyone's thoughts on what the answer should be, but then instead of giving you the, oh, here's what Jewish source suggests, what we'll do is we'll actually look at some of the sources inside, not exhaustively. Of course, there's always more to look at, but we'll try and get a sense of some of the process and methodology. How were the rabbis figuring this out? What were they looking at that would lead to an answer? And one of the questions that we'll ask ourselves is whenever they come to an answer, or when we come to an answer, how much is the answer based on a prior principle that's stated either in the Torah or early rabbinic things? You know, it's forbidden to do this. We have it written, therefore we go based on that. And how much of it is based on a general, you know, technically you should do this, ethically you should do this. And a lot of answers come to both sides in an argument might have strength to their argument, but at the end of the day, the rabbis wish we would compromise. So there's this big balance in any kind of business ethics between things that are clearly permitted or not permitted, but most cases come down to it's not always clear, which is why it's always good to have a contract. Always write a contract, and it really will deal with most of these cases. Jane just joined, so I'll invite her in, and then I will present the first case, open it up for people's thoughts, and then we'll look at the sources. So the first case, quite simple. Imagine this. A person goes into Best Buy, if anyone even goes into Best Buy anymore, and they're looking to get a new Apple Watch. Now, the Apple Watch can retail anywhere from $300 to $400, you know, a very expensive smartwatch by Apple. And they go into the store and they look at the tag, and it's actually a digital thing. Instead of a piece of paper, they have a little digital thing, and it says it's $29.99, $29.99. Now, I'm not good at fractions or percentages, but that's an insane deal off of $300 or $400. Now, what's most likely happened is the decimal place got moved, but the person picks up their watch and there's actually self-checkout. I don't know if that's true, but imagine self-checkout. They scan the watch and it comes up as $29.99. Now, there's a few things that one can do in this moment. Pay for it, walk out and hope no one says anything, or go to a sales attendant and say, I'm just checking, this is like this much percentage, like 90% off or more or something like that. Is this really the price? Now they might say, oh yeah, this is an insane deal we're having today, unlikely with Apple products. Or they might say, thank you for checking, finding the mistake. It's actually $299.99. And then there's a question, of course, about sticker prices. There's this whole thing about, oh, if whatever the sticker price is, the store has to honor it. It actually depends on the state you're in. So let's say this is a state that doesn't honor that. Because if it's a state where federal or the state law says that you have to honor the sticker price, doesn't matter what they say. Let's say the law isn't that way. So the worst case scenario is you tell the person the truth and you have to pay full price. Or you just walk out of there without saying anything and it's their mistake. Are you allowed to walk out without saying anything when you know that it's an insane deal? And maybe you even go to their website and check, and on the website it's $299.99. So you're certain it's a mistake in the store, but it's their mistake. Can you zip your mouth, get the insane deal, and just walk home scot-free? That is the question. So think about it for a second. Should that be permitted? Is it ethical? Should it be legal? Can somebody just walk out without saying something and hope for the best? As soon as you have an idea, just throw up your hand. Do you have to say anything when something is clearly insanely undermarked? It's okay if no one has any ideas. We'll find out the answer by going through the sources. All right, excellent. So tomorrow we'll start with you, and I'll have you take the first two sources because these are key. These are the background legal principles upon which this case will be built. So it actually starts in Vayikra, so not terribly long ago, a number of weeks ago, and I actually gave a Dvar Torah on these laws, and one of them is called Ona'at Mamon, which is something like ripping off or cheating or some sort of abuse financially of your fellow. So go ahead, Tamar, that first source there, where it just kind of lays out the general principle without being specific. Go ahead.
When you buy or sell to your neighbor, do not cheat one another.
So that's very simple, is clearly the Torah codifies that in business dealings, we can't rip each other off. Now, it doesn't specify what does that mean to rip someone off. And we might think, well, we're not ripping anyone off. Apple's ripping people off by charging such a markup. We're just getting a good deal. How is that hurting someone? The next source there is just specifying exactly what we're talking about here. It doesn't really add too much to it, but go ahead, Tamar, the second one from the Talmud.
When you buy or sell to your neighbor, the verse refers to monetary fraud.
So that's just clarifying it again, just an immediate commentary. Again, we're talking about buying and selling. But Tamar, I'll have you take one more because this will lay out the foundation and then we'll build on that. So Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and he was, well, he died in Egypt, but he's, from all over the world, Spain, et cetera, like that. And he adds a very important principle, which is codified as law in the Talmud, which is, it sounds like the Torah is, I can't rip you off. So if I go in and I know that an Apple Watch is $300 and Best Buy is selling it for $700, that should be forbidden by the Torah. They're clearly trying to rip me off. Now, again, obviously we can talk about all the exceptions. Why would they charge so much, supply and demand, et cetera. But let's say I go to them and I prove that they're just trying to rip me off because, they think I don't know any better. It seems like that should be forbidden by the Torah. But I'm just buying it. It's not my responsibility. That's the assumption here. That's what one might assume. It's not my responsibility as the buyer to care about the price. Not so, says Rambam and the Talmud. Okay, one more, please, Tamar.
It is forbidden for the buyer or seller to swindle another person. As it is written, when you sell something to your fellow or buy something from your fellow, do not take advantage of one another.
Excellent. So here, he doesn't even need to do some fancy midrash to get it out of the verse. You look at the verse and it says buy or sell. It says memkar, selling, and it says kaneh, it says acquiring things. So clearly this principle in the Torah about not taking advantage of someone goes both ways. So actually, if we stopped here, it would seem that the Torah would be opposed and is not like the idea of somebody taking advantage of somebody not pricing something well. And in fact, I remember years ago, I was in Prague and I was in, I don't remember exactly where it was near something called the Tin Church, Tin Square, like Tinska or something like that. And there was a store selling antiques and I was poking around inside. And I saw a yad, like the etzba, the metal thing used to like follow along in the Sefer Torah. And I was like, oh, this person probably doesn't know what they have. So maybe it's very affordable. I walk over and the price for it was like 10 million koruni or something insane that was appropriate for a thing. And in my head, I was like, this person knows exactly what they had. My goal was not to take advantage, but I thought, well, maybe they underpriced it. And people definitely do this is, if you don't know what you have, maybe I can get less for it. Well, that's also not ethical or permitted based on what we've seen so far. Any questions up until now? Excellent. So one of the, Jane, I'll unmute you and then I'll just leave you unmuted. Go ahead, please.
So I'm just thinking about the Antiques Roadshow where people go in and buy something for
those YouTube videos,
$10 and then they take it in to be valued and it's, $1,000 or something. But sometimes that's just an ignorance. That's not deliberate.
That or it's
they might have an idea that it might be more valuable than the person who's selling.
Yeah. Or they bought it as a lot or an estate sale and the person was just saying, take it all. I don't care about valuing things properly. Exactly. So one of the next questions, and then Jane, I'll have you read this next source then, is what does it mean to rip someone off? If something is valued at $30 and someone charges $35 for it to make a profit, is that ripping off? Mm-hmm. Someone has something for $30 and they sell it for 25 cents. Is that undervaluing to the point where I'm like, I can't in all good conscience buy this from you because I know the buyer, am ripping you off. So what is the threshold for at which point it becomes inappropriate to either buy at such a low price or sell at such a high price? So the Mishnah has an explicit rule for that. So I'll have you take the next two sources, but go ahead, Jane, in the Mishnah, please.
Fraud is constituted by an overcharge of 4 silver coins in 24, hence a sixth of the purchase.
That's it. So that's the rabbinic rule. So in a rabbinic and in a Jewish market owned by Jews, selling to Jews, again, within this closed system. And again, there's lots of other conversations. What about a Jewish owned store who's selling to non-Jews? Does the mitzvah apply there? All kinds of conversations about that. But the basic principle is that if I have something that is $6, I'll just try and do some easy math. 1/6 of $6 is $1. So I could sell it for $7, but I couldn't sell it for $10. Now, again, we're going to talk about important exceptions to that, but principally, that's the basic rule, is that you're allowed to go up to 1/6 of the price. Now, something that's worth $10,000, 1/6 of that price is obviously significantly more, and that's a nice markup. You can make a nice profit off of that. In truth, something that's $6, $1 markup, I never owned a business, maybe that's a decent markup. That I can't really say, but 1/6 is the markup. And by the way, both ways, meaning that I could sell something that costs $6 for $5, no problem with the Torah. But if I sell it for $2, potentially I'm running into a problem in a vacuum with no other factors whatsoever. And this is a key thing we'll come back to, if the market value of something is 6, I shouldn't be able to sell it for more than 7 or less than 5 in the absence of any other mitigating factors. So this next source here is really important. This is finally getting us closer to our final answer for this thing. And we jumped ahead chronologically. Now that we basically have the principles, that people generally play with. And again, I'm skipping over some and I'll fill in the gaps as we go. And I've mentioned a few key things. Market value. If there's no market value for something, if it's a piece of art where the market value isn't determined by how much wheat costs, but the market value is determined by how much people love Van Gogh, or I forget his name, but there's this incredible, I think, Chinese artist who's selling for more than Van Gogh. What's the value of that? It's whatever people decide it is. But based on the going value of something, if once that's established, can you go beyond that? Can I sell something for $7, or can I sell something that's worth $7? Everyone agrees it's worth $7. Can I sell it for $1,000? So go ahead, Jane, and take this one from the Aruch HaShulchan, 19th century, please.
You mean you want me to go down to there? Okay. If the
Yeah,
seller,
please.
if the seller doesn't know the real price and the buyer realizes that he is unintentionally being offered an unreasonably low price, he must alert the seller. Otherwise, he transgresses a negative commandment.
So if the other person doesn't realize that they have unintentionally broken the Torah law by undercharging, if someone's overcharging, you can bet somebody's going to say, this is insane. Why am I paying this much? I even went into a store today and asked about a product that they carried, and the person was like, we don't carry that because it's so priced up. Like, it's a great product, but it's insane, the markup, so we just don't even carry it in our store. So here it's talking about being undercharged. So this is the answer to our case. The Aruch HaShulchan gives us our answer, which is based on all these principles, that it is forbidden to underpay or overcharge. And again, overcharge is the seller, underpay is me, the buyer. I can't pay $29.99 for that Apple Watch. I can't walk out of the store without saying something. I have to say something. And if I don't, it's not like I'm letting that person get away with a sin. I myself am sinning by underpaying for something. I am basically ripping off the buyer. So that's the answer to our question. So again, if it was Friday night, I would have jumped more or less straight to this. But now you've seen again the principles that he bases it on, which is established by the rabbi, that it's both sides of the relationship, buyer and seller, and they have even a number principle at 1/6. So if it's underpriced, it's 1/8 under the price, I don't have to say anything. Even if they're selling an Apple Watch for cheaper than I've seen it anywhere, but the drop down is less than 1/6, I don't have to say anything. I can keep my mouth shut. More than 1/6, I have to say something. So before we go on to our last source in this section about a really big exception to this, because again, commerce generally doesn't work this way. I don't have to go into every store and look up the MSRP, the manufacturer suggested price, retail price. I don't have to find out what it costs, what they're charging, say, is your profit reasonable? And again, a lot of this may only apply between Jews, but let's say it did apply all over the place. Do I have to go around and constantly be asking, what's your markup? Or are you really selling it for this little? I went into a store today to get my kids a little toy and it was crazy cheap, but I did not need to go ask them if that was a reasonable price. So any questions before we look at a huge exception that allows commerce to move forward? Yes, Elizabeth, please.
So,
Yep.
Just two quick comments. none of these are saying Jew versus Jew or Jew versus non-Jew. So I'm wondering if that plays into it. Then the other thing I'm kind of coming to my mind as I'm listening to this and visualizing it is, you know, it was almost quaint when like Rambam was writing this or having an opinion, or anybody else, that you knew this neighbor and you knew if you weren't paying the full price that it would affect him and his family. Now you go into, as you suggested, Best Buy. I mean, really, you know?
Yeah, so there's two important things you said. Who does this apply to? Now, this is all based on a mitzvah from the Torah, and the language there is buying and selling like amitecha. And now there's some fascinating commentary that I think I mentioned maybe when I gave the class or the Dvar Torah about who's included in that, but it's basically an understanding that it's between fellow Jews. Now, that does not mean that it should be fine to rip off non-Jews because of a very key, and in fact, there's a very disturbing but important conversation in the Talmud. And it's in the section, I believe it's Bava Kama, Kuf Yud Gimel, something like that, but it's in the section dealing with civil law. And it's someone had stated that it's actually permitted to steal from non-Jews. Gezel goy mutar, theft from non-Jew or someone from another nation is permitted. Now the rabbis of the Talmud, they don't just throw principles out and say that's wrong, goodbye. They have to deal with it and mitigate it and limit it. So what they start doing is they go through all of these different, you know, in circles saying that only applies to a non-Jew who is unethical themselves, like Robin Hood ripping off the sheriff of Nottingham. That would be, and they really do talk about a tax collector. You can rip him off. And then they say, no, even then it's not permitted. So they keep limiting the case to if you go into a store and they give you back a little extra change, you don't have to give it back. And they limit it so much that it almost rarely comes up. And in the end, they say, don't ever do it anyways. Why? Because you don't want to create a desecration of God's name, the Hebrew phrase Chilul Hashem, because we know about people like Bernie Madoff, who, let's say, he could say, well, I was dealing with non-Jews, which is not true. I think he was dealing with Jews as well, but he could say for the non-Jews, it doesn't matter. Stealing from non-Jews is fine. Well, look what it's done to the Jewish name. Any anti-Semites have more fire and power than they ever did, and it lowers all of the reputation of Jews and more than that of God. When we're dragged through the mud, God's name is dragged through the mud. And in fact, the parallel conversation in the Jerusalem Talmud says it a little differently. Instead of don't rip non-Jews off so that we won't get the Jews in trouble, it says go out of your way to be just in your business dealings so that non-Jews will start saying, wow, Jews are really honest in business, praise God. Unfortunately, that's not the reality of the relationship between Jews and business. But again, principally speaking, this is between Jews. But why should you never rip someone off? Or why should you go out of your way to say, are you sure this price is right? Because it makes Jews look good. And more importantly, if they call you and say, sir, we saw on your credit card, you bought the Apple Watch for $29.99. I'm sorry, that's not right. You got to come back in. And I come back in with my kippah and my tzitzit. That just doesn't look good. And they'll think, oh, look at the Jews trying to, you know, cop a deal or something like that. So technically, could a Jew get away with this? But if they're non-Jews, probably. Should they? Absolutely not. So excellent question there. And to your second question, and the answer is very much connected. No, it's Best Buy. Who cares? They have plenty of money. Again, it goes back to that thing. Maybe, and not even technically, it's certainly not permitted. It's breaking the law. But ethically speaking, Jews need to be better than that. We're not always, but we need to be better than that because the action of one Jew reflects on all Jews, and again, upon the name of God in this world. So even if it's silly, things like copyright law, I gave a class on that. Even the rabbis say technically downloading, illegal MP3s and music maybe it's technically okay because it's not a physical thing you're stealing. Should a Jew do it anyways? No, because it's not the right thing to do and it's considered illegal. So at the end of the day, ethically speaking, a Jew needs to go above and beyond. But two excellent questions, Elizabeth, and I'll leave you unmuted for this last source here, which is I go up to the person and I say, this is amazing, but insane. And they say, you know what? Again, I said in certain states, they by law have to honor the sticker price. So let's say they did that. It's a state where they have to honor the sticker price. And they say, oh my gosh, we made such a mistake, but legally we have to sell it to you for that. What if I say, well, I can't buy it for that because the Torah says less than a sixth, I can't do it, so I have to pay you more money. Is there an exception? If they say, no, we will sell it to you for this, we must, it is the law, you're doing nothing wrong, you're not being unethical, it's our mistake, buy it. Can I pay 20? I really want an Apple Watch now for $30, not for $300. So the Shulchan Aruch, 16th century, this is what he says. I believe this is the one. Yeah, this is the one I'm looking for. Go ahead, Elizabeth, please. Source 6.
Number 6, someone who deals honestly is not subject to the prohibition of fraud. For example, if the seller says, I bought this object for such and such an amount, and such an amount is my profit, he is not guilty of fraud.
Meaning, this is specifically about profit overcharging, but it could apply both ways. If there is a mutual understanding, both parties are aware of what the price is in relation to what it should be, the market value, and both parties agree to it, then it is not ona'ah, because the key of that Hebrew phrase, ona'ah, which again has, etymologically, it might be, afflicting someone, but like cheating them, ripping them off. If I say it's worth $10, I'm charging you 30 because it's a like there are stores in town that I love and I still go to, even though I know for a fact that their markup is insane, but they're a small business and I love them for it. But everybody knows that when they go in there. They're not trying to rip people off, clearly not. And when that is known, is it ripping off if both parties say, oh, I'm okay with this? And the answer is no. Ona'ah, ripping someone off, does not apply when it is a mutual understanding. And while this is not the main source for it, that general principle would apply to things like buying art. The canvas that Van Gogh and the paints that he mixed together are not worth millions of dollars, but everyone understands that you are not paying for the canvas, you are paying for the honor of owning a painting. Of Mary Cassatt, who's one of the greatest impressionist painters. I'm reading a book by her about her right now, but you understand that you are buying the value of owning that painting, not for it. And as long as you are understanding that, a person is not getting ripped off. And again, it would go both ways. So technically speaking, if I go into a store and they're having 90% off deals, which a lot of places do, it's fine because they say, we are having a deal for Father's Day, for graduation, grads, et cetera, like that. And as long as it's mutual and both sides are in on it, as it were, it can't be ona'ah. So the 1/6 rule comes in when I own a store and I want to mark up my products and I don't tell anybody what they cost. I know that they're worth 50 cents. I can only mark them up in a vacuum up to 1/6 of the price, or undercharged if I want to undercut the competition, which will come up in the next source there. But in a vacuum, I have to hold by that. But again, in our consumer world today, there's so many ways. Susan, I see your hand up, I'll get you in a second. There's so many ways to get around it, to charge more or to charge a lot less. But again, the key here is that there has to be an awareness of it. And a lot of that comes to trusting businesses. Do businesses have to, with every single product, have a little tag that says, here's the original cost, here's our profit on that? And the general understanding is no. Why? Because when you walk into a store, the understanding is that their markups are within the market value. But if it becomes known that a store is ripping people off, and let's say it is a Jewish-owned business, then they might be breaking a biblical commandment. But if their markups are within the realm of what other stores are charging for things, even if it's a bit more because of inflation, and that's another factor too, inflation raises the threshold of what a product can cost. It raises the general market value. In all of those cases, things can cost more than 1/6. But in a vacuum, if there's no way for my customers to know, and there's no reason for me to do it more than that, I can't go up more than 1/6. There has to be some mitigating factor for me to make more than a profit. And again, it's not hard to get out of that, but principally, we don't rip people off. And again, it's both ways. The buyer is responsible to take care of the seller as well, even if they're the biggest corporation in the world. Susan, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, when you buy a painting, you're not paying for the honor of owning that painting. You're paying for the work, the creative work that the person did. So
Absolutely,
that's important, and that deserves recognition.
100%. There's so factors. There's a value of you being able to, you buy it for $1 million, you might be able to sell it for 2 million. So you pay more for that. You buy the prestige of the artist and the hard work. There's so many factors that go into it. At this point, if you're buying a Van Gogh, he's dead. So, he's not working that hard these days. His brand is constantly coming out with new stuff. But yes, that is an excellent point, Susan. And that's key here is, again, the valuation of something is not just, oh, what is it? There was a show where they said like a human being, the chemicals in a person, at least in 1950, was worth like $1.50 or something like that, just the basic chemicals of a person. But the value of a person is worth a lot more than $1.50 or whatever it was. And that's very key. Valuing something is a very complicated thing. And making a profit is a complicated thing. But if you take into consideration what's reasonable, what's the market value, what's an appropriate markup for profit, for advertising and everything, and it's within the market realm, no problem. But a Jew who says, I'm just going to sell it for whatever I want because I'm the only game in town because I have a monopoly, that's when there's a real problem. And in fact, they're probably not owned by Jews. There are big corporations, particularly internet companies, phone companies, that I think really are guilty of this because they hide, technically they say it in their 800-page agreements, but they really do hide all of these hidden fees so that the markup for their profit becomes exorbitant and way more than it should be because there's no competition. That's where something like this Torah principle is crying out, you're hurting people. You are absolutely hurting people, and there's a way for you to make a great profit without going to this extreme. And they're absolutely hiding all of the things behind the true value of the product. So excellent point, Susan. Beautiful. Any final comments before we go on to case 2 tonight? We're going to do 2 cases each evening, this week and next week. And I'll give you a preview of one of the cases for next week because I mentioned it in the past. Beautiful. Oh, was there any hands up? Excellent. Okay, so Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this one is actually based on a very interesting and troubling story. So Subway, there's actually, there was a kosher one in LA, and I don't know if it's still there, but it was a kosher one in, I think it was Cleveland, Ohio, maybe. I don't know if it's still there. But what I learned, Jane says yes. And I went there, I think when we came out here, actually, we stayed near Cleveland and we went there and I love their tuna sub. But Subway, apparently their marketing practices that are now coming under scrutiny, we'll see what happens, is that instead of, they're franchised, which means that instead of the company owning it, they go to somebody, they go to Rabbi Dinah and say, you can open a Subway and it costs you nothing. I'll make up a number. It costs $10,000. I could easily get a loan for $10,000 in the bank. It might be more, but it's something very small. And the initial setup costs are small because there's no cooking. All the ingredients just need to be refrigerated. They're all cheese and stuff like that. So it's really easy to open up a Subway. So you think low cost for entry, great. Easy to set up, great. Well, there's 2 issues here. One that we're not talking about tonight is that Subway takes an insane amount of your income. I don't know what it was, but for every sandwich you make, let's say you sell for $10, they take like $6. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. But this is the other thing. Usually you would think that the parent company, Subway, their goal would be, let's make sure that each of my franchises is really successful. Why? Because the more successful a Subway store is, the more money we bring in. I don't even care about the franchisee. The more they make, the more I make. Well, that's not the way they do it. Let's say there's a Subway on 60th and Oklahoma, which, as I mentioned, I was there today, really cheap gas, $4.99. Well, Subway will then allow another Subway to open up on 61st in Oklahoma. And if someone wants to buy to them and say, can I open up on 63rd in Oklahoma? Guess what Subway's probably going to say? Yes. If you go to a place like Manhattan, it's like, what was it? There was something like 9 or 10 Subways within an hour or 2 walking distance, meaning in just a couple hours, you could hit up every single one of those Subways. My numbers are not exactly precise, but it's very close to that. You could easily look this up. But that is insane to allow all these stores. And guess what? They're like, oh, it's great. They'll compete with each other. No, they all end up undercutting each other. And as we know on the east side, we have 2 Subways really close to each other. One closed down, probably because there was another one 2 minutes away. So should it be permitted for all of these Subways to just open up right down the block from each other? Because I have a Subway and I'm like, if you open there, you're going to take my business. That should be forbidden. Well, should it? So we're not talking here about the hardware store opening up to a candy shop. We're talking about a candy shop opening next to a candy shop. Should it be permitted for a store that will be in clearly direct competition? Clearly direct competition for the exact same audience, almost identical, should it be permitted for them to open up within very close distance? Now, something we're not going to talk about is how do we define that? But I would say, let's say as simple as same block. Mea Shearim in Israel. It's a very popular street, in the Orthodox neighborhood. Can I open up a Jewish bookstore right next door to a Jewish bookstore? So before we get into the sources, here's some thoughts. And Gloria Leonard, you're unmuted. You don't have to share your initial thoughts, but you can just start talking and we'll all hear you. You have an initial. Yeah, Leonard, please.
Wait, he's not saying.
Oh, before you read, Leonard, no, I was just curious if anyone has any thoughts. Do you think it should be permitted for total free competition, unfettered competition, Subway's principle of open every store you want, go at each other's throats. I don't care who lives or dies, just let's open as many as possible. Because at the end of the day, I think it's not just a percentage of sales. I think they have to, it's like a set cost. Maybe that's why they do it, because no matter what, whether you're bringing in sales or not, you still have to pay, the daddy corporation. I think that was one of the key things why it made sense for Subway to do it. Should it be permitted to just open up next to a business you are in direct competition to, or I don't know what the phrase is, or should there be some sort of, law against opening up with, immediate, again, I'm sure there's a phrase for this.
There should,
right.
yeah, I would think there should be laws that limit that possibility.
And what's the, without going into, not a trick question or anything, what's the fundamental thing? Why should a business that's trying to compete with me, that's doing the exact same thing, why would I not want them to open up next door? Because what do they do to me?
They'll
You
take away
lose
your
business.
money.
Yeah, they'll lose business and they might put me out of business. And that's exactly what's happening with these Subways. And I'm sure countless places. Now there's extreme positions where a Target or a Walmart opening up to a tiny little market. That's one where, this if this is, you're right, Leonard, if that's the law, that would be it on steroids. That would say, Walmart, you can't open up because you're going to destroy all of these businesses. So the question is, does Jewish law have a law against doing this? So the conversation starts with that explicit question, but it doesn't give us a great answer right away. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a bit, and Gloria, I'll have you take this first source from the Talmud. And the reason we're starting with the Talmud is because, and this is an important thing about laws in civil law, is oftentimes the law is, or the principle is not stated in the Torah. We were lucky with our first case. The principle was, at least the basis of it was in the Torah, and you could build off of that. And there are a lot of civil laws that are in the Torah that we can build off of, but there are certain cases about competition the Torah doesn't explicitly talk about. But our understanding, the traditional one, is that all of those principles that would help us deal with today were all passed down orally. And not necessarily where Moshe sat down and say, when Subway starts opening up their franchises, here's what you should do, but more that general understandings about how people should deal with each other. What does it mean to be fair and just? Were passed down, and they were applied by different rabbis building on each other. The oral tradition doesn't mean a book that's 9 billion pages long with every case ever. It means some things that have been taught for thousands of years, at least 1,500, almost certainly 2,000, and probably older than that, that these principles have been built on for generations. So here is, again, one that's at least 1,500 years old, almost certainly hundreds of years older than that. So go ahead, please, Gloria, this first source.
Rav Huna said, if a resident of an alley sets up a hand mill and another resident of the alley wants to set up one next to him, the first has the right to stop him, because he could say to him, you are interfering with my livelihood.
So if it stopped there and the Talmud moved on to another subject, boom, we would have it. We have a right to say to someone, you can't open up that Subway or a similar business next to me. But the conversation goes on, as the Talmud often does, and they have differing traditions, because again, they're dealing with the same basic principles about what is just and fair in business, but the final rulings are not there. So they can take the same building blocks. They're reading the same Torah, but you can end up in two very different places. They even have a tradition for that. They say there's 70 different Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 faces to the Torah. There are at least 70 ways to understand any given word or idea in the Torah. So here we're going to have 2 or 3 that don't quite jive. So go ahead, Gloria, the second paragraph.
Said Rabbeinu to Rabbah, does this mean that Rav Huna adopts the same principle as Rabbi Yehuda? That is a minority opinion? Or we have learned, Rabbi Yehuda says that a shopkeeper should not give presents of parched corn and nuts to children because he thus entices them to come back to him. The sages, however, allow this. So how then could he argue with a majority view?
So here's what's going on here. Now, this is actually not an explicit rejection of the first clause. The first clause says, if somebody's about to open up a business next to me, that's the same, a hand mill in this case, I can say, no, you can't do it. The second one here, ultimately we care what the rabbis say. The rabbis say, if there are already 2 businesses next to each other, a guy can put free samples of his product outside and to entice people to come in. Now you would say, well, that's unfair because you giving out free samples or having a Sunday, huge sale is going to undercut my business. But the rabbis say those kinds of enticements are permitted. Now that's not the same as saying you can open up a business next to me. Again, this is saying if a competing business is next door, they can do things like crazy deals and enticements that will potentially take away from your business. But the key principle here is, do we say that you are not allowed to have any competition, or you can have any competition whatsoever? And it's clear here, the answer is somewhere in the middle. This one is saying you can't, we don't want you to open up a business next door, but if it's already next door, it's okay to, do stuff to make your business do a little bit better. So the last section here, go ahead, Gloria, please.
Actually, he may very well be in agreement with the rabbis, for the ground on which the rabbis allowed the shopkeeper to do this was because he can say to his rival, just as I make presents of nuts, so you can make presents of almonds. But in this case, perhaps the rabbis would agree that the first man can say to the other, you are interfering with my livelihood.
Two things that are added here. One is, why is it okay for me to have a sale where I do everything 5% off? Because you know what? The guy next door that has the same business can also make a sale with 5% off or 4% off. Why can I have free samples of my product? Because the guy next door can have free samples of his product. But the rabbis end this conversation by saying, but maybe it is okay to say you can't do that because you're still going to take business away from me. And maybe it's not easy for me to do a sale because my profit margin is really thin and I can't afford to do free samples. But ultimately, this conversation that is discussing the principles and lays out everything we're going to talk about does not give us an answer. There are two sides to it. One is you could potentially open up next door because you know what? Yeah, you're taking away his business, but maybe he could do something to take away your business. But the flip side is that's not right. Why are you trying to take away the food off of my children's table? So those are the two principles. Fair competition. I can have a great business. Again, it's against monopolies. The monopolies are a bad thing. The rabbis say everybody should push each other to become better. But the flip side, we don't want somebody to lose business and potentially not be able to pay the light bill. So we don't have a definitive answer here. So the Talmud actually continues on. So Leonard, I'll have you take this next one. And this is a little bit later in this section of the Talmud. Oh, that's too much. Go ahead. An objection, please.
An objection was raised against Rav Huna's ruling.
Here, I can try and zoom in a wee bit more.
Okay, thank you. From the following source, quote, a man may open a shop next to another man's shop or a bathhouse next to another man's bathhouse. And the latter cannot object because he can say,
sorry,
it's okay, to him, quote, you do what you like in your property,
you can
and
guess the words.
I do what I like in mine. Exactly.
Excellent. So this actually goes to kind of the principle I was laying out there, which is about the rabbis saying fair play, or fair competition, which is, so this lays out the principle. It seems like it is okay to open up a shop. They're bringing, again, what's the Hebrew word there? They say meitive, which is like is a direct challenge against what was said about Rav Huna's ruling about you can't, if somebody has a hand mill, you can't open up next to me. They say, of course you can. Why? Because I own this spot right here. This is my spot. You don't own the town. So again, this is very fascinating and absolutely comes up in things like unions, monopolies, and all those kinds of contemporary laws, at least within a Jewish setting. If you're going to a rabbinic court and saying, this guy wants to, and by the way, I remember a few years ago, there's a journal from the Beit Din of America, which is a huge organization of rabbinic courts. And they actually started publishing some of their opinions in long form. So this magazine, I don't know if they still publish it, it was like 30-page article. And one of the first issues I got was about a candy store. And it was a real case. I think they, changed the names to protect the innocent, but it was somewhere in New York. And it was exactly about a candy shop. And I think I might have even known which candy shop it was, but they brought all of these sources. And it was so interesting how they, I don't remember actually their final ruling. We'll see if we can recreate it from the sources here. But all of this is absolutely still relevant when it's between Jewish businesses. There may not be, depending on, there may be local, state, or city laws about competition. But if it's two Jews in a neighborhood and they're both observant Jews, could they go to a court and say, I don't want them opening up a candy shop? So this is, now we're getting to the 16th century and looking at some of the ways that it has been ruled. So let's see. Jane, I'll go ahead and unmute you. And if you'll please take this source from the Shulchan Aruch, and the section Choshen Mishpat is the one that deals with civil law. And again, it's one that I've been on my own time learning, and it's very exciting. So please.
If there is a practitioner of some profession in one alleyway or a store, and another person comes and wishes to set up shop there selling the same items, he may do so. The first store owner cannot stand in his way by claiming, "You are depriving me of a livelihood." This applies even if the second person comes from a different alleyway in the same city.
Excellent, thank you. So they rule based on that second source from the Talmud that Leonard read, which is that, no, you can't open up shop next to someone because ultimately you could just make your business better. We have to have fair and free business. And it's so interesting because, again, a lot of these sources, the Talmudic sources, are 1,500 years old. And not that Jews are the only ones figuring out, fair business practice, but these are the things that are still being dealt with today with major companies, fair competition, monopolies, et cetera, like that. But in the 16th century, it was codified, and it was codified before the Shulchan Aruch as well, that ultimately, yeah, you can open up shop right next to someone, but there's something really interesting as a side note here. He says that even if this guy had his shop somewhere else in the same city, he can move closer to you if you have the more popular alleyway. And again, they're talking about, what are the cities that have alleyways, old, Elizabethan cities and stuff like that. But what's that key thing here? He says, alleyway in the same city. What's not included? Somebody who's coming from
Another city?
another city. Now, somebody who moves to town and they've set up residence and they live there, that's fine. But if somebody remotely sets up a shop, an owner who doesn't live in your city, they're from a totally different municipality, and they're setting up franchises, and they have nothing, they have no connection to your city, they don't pay taxes. The rabbis talk about taxes being an important part of that. They have nothing to do with your city. They give nothing to your city. All they want is to take. The rabbis forbid that. So again, it's that balancing board, and all of the principles are in some ways being built on, but also kind of being figured out as we go along. And it's about differing principles because we don't have a hard concrete law. The Torah does not say fair competition and free market, gesundheit, hate, go for it. Nor does it say that you have to, respect everyone's area. You can't, there's a phrase in the Talmud about casting your net in another guy's fishing area. It's not from the Torah. These are principles being developed as the rabbis are basically looking at society and trying to figure out, based on their neighbors and their non-Jewish neighbors, and seeing what works for them, and based on real cases that come up. And they look to the Torah. They look to the ethical basis about what's fair and what's just. And they say it's not just to steal, but it's a stealing. And the reason it's not stealing is because the other person could just adjust their business. But at the same time, if somebody's coming from another city and they're giving nothing back to the city, you know what? That's not fair. If you're setting up a business here, even if you take business away from that guy, at least you're helping everyone indirectly. But if not, then it's forbidden. So before we go on to the final two sources, any questions up until now? Excellent. So, oh yeah, Gloria, go ahead and just unmute yourself. Please.
So, for example, on Downer Avenue, there are a line of stores, and they're probably all owned by, that block, I think, is owned by a corporation. Would this apply to them, not letting another, say, I don't know, a stationery store next to one that's already established? The people are just renting the space, I think. They're not buying, they're not buying the part of the building. They're just renting it. So should the owner of the line of stores let two similar ones be, right next to each other? There are restaurants on Downer that are right next to each other.
Let me see if I understand your question. Let's do one that's even more easy. A mall. I actually know a Jewish family in LA that owns a lot of malls. So let's say I own the entire mall and I own every single space, and Foot Locker comes and says, we want a space in there. So I say, okay, Foot Locker. And then I'm going to say Payless, but they're gone. So Journey, which is think I've never been in there. Maybe for my daughter I was in there. Journey Kids, they also sell shoes, says, I want to open up next door. And I say, sure. Can I say to 5 different shoe stores, you can all open up next to each other? Is that kind of your question? Do I have a responsibility to
Right.
monitor who's going into my space? So the answer based on this would be, I don't want to say not really, like, I should pay attention to everybody's bottom line as a business practice, but ethically speaking, every one of those businesses, and this is important, has just as much a right to be there and compete for, foot traffic. Now, if I'm an idiot, and again, I let 5 stores that are all doing subs open next to each other, it's going to hurt all of them, which ultimately will hurt me because those spaces will all shut down, or half of them will shut down. But ethically speaking, they all have a right to be there. Now, again, if a company from Sweden says we want to open up a store, a sub store in the mall, and we're going to own it, but we're not going to be there, we're not going to pay taxes or anything like that, and we want to open it next to your Subway, which is an American company, then as a Jewish mall owner, maybe I have some responsibility to say no, unless you live here and you are an American. And I'm not saying this is like a nationalist thing, I'm just saying, trying to apply this principle in some big areas, then maybe I would say it's not appropriate for you to be here unless you are part of our American tax system. Now, again, there are ways to get around it, and we can make agreements. And ultimately, a lot of what makes business sense is also as important as what makes ethical sense. But ethically and legally speaking, everybody has a right to compete, and it is not unethical for someone to open up next door. However, let me see if it's the next source or if I just brought it outside. Yes, this next source is real important. This is the Walmart question. So let's see. Oh, Susan, you're not there. If you're not there, that's totally fine. This next source here, Elizabeth, I will go ahead and unmute you, is a really cool book. It's from the 19th century, Kovno, and he had a long name, but Rabbi Eisenstadt. And what he did is, in the 19th century, he basically looked at the Shulchan Aruch, and then he looked through hundreds of years of different responsa, real world questions that had been asked about cases based on the laws in the Shulchan Aruch and how it had been ruled. And he abridged and put them together in this work called Pitkei Teshuvah. And what I think it's either Pitkei Teshuvah, I think that's the one. And he brought all of these rulings together. And this way you could look at what were all of the practical rulings, or what have they been for the last couple hundred years. So you'll see in a moment why I call this the Walmart question. So go ahead, please, Elizabeth.
If one person has a store at the end of a cul-de-sac, he can prevent another from setting up a store at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, since it's impossible for customers to reach the original store without passing the new one, and he is in effect draining all of the customers away.
Excellent. And by the way, the reason I was paused there for a moment on describing it is this work is Pitkei, from the word patach, the openings of Teshuvah, but in Ashkenazi traditional circles, the taf is sa. So many people call it Piskei Tshuva. It's printed on the page of the Shulchan Aruch, and it does that. It brings in many for hundreds of years worth of Teshuvot. There's another 6 or 7 volume set that's actually called Piskei Tshuva with a samech, so it's supposed to be a sa sound, and it's a long form version that's even more recent. I think it's 20th century, that does basically the same thing. So I always get, it's entirely possible I even got them confused now, but I think that's the difference. But they're basically doing the same thing, is bringing in all of these different, how has the Shulchan Aruch actually been ruled on in real cases? So that's why I paused and was confused for a moment. So I hope I identified this one correctly. But what this is saying is, yes, if we're in an alleyway that has lots of foot traffic going both ways, and somebody wants to open a candy shop next to me, and they live in our city, they have every right to do so. And if they say, I'm having a 20% off sale with free samples, you know what? You could do a 20% off sale with free samples. You can't, that's on you. But let's say there's a cul-de-sac, you and I live at one end. You have to walk all the way to the end to get to my store, which people do because I've been the only candy shop. But this guy opens one right at the front of it, and people don't make it past him. So he's not taking 10% of my business, he's getting 100%. because people don't want to walk more than 5 feet if they don't have to. So he destroys my business. That's not permitted. And this applies in a lot of other ways. Let's say something like a Walmart, because they're a massive brand, can lower prices by 40%. But I'm a small business. And if I did 40% even for a day, I'd be done. I'd have to close up shop in a week. In that case, it's not permitted, not necessarily whether Walmart could open or not, but doing things like that, insane deals, insanely underpricing things, which ties back to our first case. They cannot do that. They cannot do something that it is impossible for another business to do, or that would directly take away, all of my business. That's not competition anymore. And that's the key thing here. If it's competition, it means both sides have a chance to work with each other. One side might be stronger. That's fine. The rabbis are okay with some free market, a little bit of, natural selection, the strongest survive, but not when it's completely unfair. So if a business is owned locally, but the person happens to have inherited billions of dollars, so they can spend the first 3 years making zero profit, not okay. And a rabbinic court would say that is absolutely inappropriate. You may not do that. You must either charge more for your products so it's more fair, or you can't open the shop here. That's very, very important. So the final source that I will take here is actually from a really lovely article by Rav Chaim Jachter, who again is a contemporary rabbi in Jersey, who both teaches at high school, writes incredible works, all available online now, called Gray Matter, because they make you think. And he also sets up Eruvin, and he does Gittin, Jewish divorces. He's just awesome. So he actually mentions a ruling from the American rabbi, Rav Moshe Feinstein Zatzal. So he says, Rav Moshe Feinstein, in his Igrot Moshe, rules that one may not open a business if it will destroy someone else's livelihood. So he's ruling here essentially what I said, based on the Pitkei Teshuvah. Rav Moshe rules that a loss of livelihood is not defined by a loss of one's home or his ability to put food on the table. So if you want to say, if you come into this town, I'm going to lose my home or I can't buy dinner, that's not what it is. Instead, he claims taking away one's ability to afford as much as the average person in his socioeconomic class constitutes destroying his livelihood. So if a business is going to make it so my family literally has no home or food, of course, Rav Moshe says that's totally forbidden. But he says you don't have to go that far. If this business opening up is going to make it so that I can have food, I can have my home, but let's say I was at this level of lower middle class, and now or I was middle class, and it's going to knock me down to lower class or upper lower class, whatever it is like that, it's going to hurt me that much that it'll fundamentally change the quality of life of my family. Not destroy my family, but fundamentally change quality of life. Rav Moshe would say that is an inappropriate amount of competition. But if Walmart opens up and I lose 10% of sales, so my 50-foot yacht has to become a 40-foot yacht now, that's not something it's an absurd thing, but that's saying that's permitted. So if it's going to make my business suffer a little bit, you know what? That's fair market competition. If it's going to put me out of business, put my family on the street, that's already way too far. But if it's going to make it so that my quality of life, and I can't send my kids to as good a school as I should be able to, based on my community, that's probably too far. And again, these are the questions. If someone says, what, he's lost 10% of his sales, is that really that bad? He still lives in his nice house. It's not necessarily an objective question. It's a little bit subjective about how much competition is permitted when it's going to make your competitors suffer. So the rabbis are constantly finding a balance between free market competition and how much is appropriate and how much is going too far. And you can see it's a constantly evolving conversation. One of those reasons is business keeps changing. Business is globalized. Business is franchised. It's not, someone had said about the quaint days of Rambam and the way things are set up. It's not the way things are set up anymore. And the beauty and excitement of Jewish business ethics and business law is that it is constantly adapting quite beautifully to the realities of today, to money, physical money not being a thing anymore. I know I'm oversimplifying, but as business changes, Jewish law is able to change with it. And I said a quick preview of next week to whet your appetites is we talked about in the class on Jewish pig farming in Israel, how it is forbidden for a Jew to make their main business owning non-Jewish animals like pigs. But what if I invest in McDonald's, where they have frozen yogurt that's not kosher per se, but it's not treif, but they also sell pork. can I own stock in a company that explicitly sells non-kosher food? And does it matter whether I'm a majority stockholder or I own 0.001%? So that's one of the two cases that we will discuss next week. But again, Jewish business ethics is alive, and it's not just about businesses. It does apply to us, the consumer, even when we walk into a store, not wasting the time of the store seller and being honest when we notice something going on in the store. Even if technically, if they're not Jewish, we don't necessarily have to speak up. It is the responsibility of a Jew who represents the reputation of all Jews and of God to speak up. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the technical ruling is. At the end of the day, we are guided by the principle of doing what is right.